They come early, so I went out to Grand Haven State Park, and there was a short-eared owl flying out over the lake, about half a mile out. So that was pretty magnificent, I thought. And I have never seen a Kirtland warbler during migration in over 25 years. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here before this group. So what I'll do today is give you a little bit of background on the biology of Kirtland's warbler. We'll talk a little bit about both ends of both its breeding range, its wintering range, just a tiny bit on migration because so little is known about Kirtland's warblers during migration, and then some of the conservation efforts that are taking place at both ends of its range. And then some of the other landscape features, other things that benefit from conservation of Kirtland's warbler. So I've been working with Kirtland's warblers since, in the Bahamas mostly, on the wintering ground since 2002. So I've been going down once or twice a year, studying the bird down there, working with our colleagues in the Bahamians to try to promote conservation for the bird. And it's been a very rewarding project, and I'll describe some attributes of that work. So there's the Kirtland's warbler, a nice male, intense gray-blue on the back, with streaks on the side. I'm sure you can see its tail wagging.
Yeah.
And then the broken eye ring, which is a very characteristic trait for the Kirtland's warbler. Let's see. There we go. Is in fact the rarest North American migratory species, and the population has probably never been large. It's always been restricted to very specialized habitat, the young jack pine that we see in the northern Lower Peninsula around Grayling and Mayo. It has to be a jack pine roughly from 5 to 15 to 20 feet tall. That stands maybe 1,400 trees per acre, something like that, with scattered openings. If the trees get too tall, it's out of there. And if they're too short, they won't use that either. So historically, it was dependent upon fire. That's what to those jack pine areas and created the young jack pine forest. However, today it's mandated to put fire out. There are a lot of structures and that sort of thing embedded in those jack pine forests now. So it's now what we call a conservation reliant species, meaning that if we didn't manage for Kirtland's warbler, it would be extinct because the fires are put out. So we'll describe some of the management techniques that are implemented to ensure that the Kirtland's warbler survives. And the Kirtland's warbler, and even though it's rare, you might think very little is known about it, but in fact, it's so interesting, and because it is rare, it's received a lot of studies. So we actually know a relatively large amount about the Kirtland's warbler. And very generally, you can see on the image to the right, those red lines indicate the approximate migration route from Michigan down to the Bahamas. And it winters primarily in Michigan. 95% of the world's population breeds in the northern Lower Peninsula. There are a few in the Upper Peninsula, about 20 or 30 in Wisconsin, maybe 20 or 30 pairs in Ontario. That's the total range of the bird. And it winters only in the Bahamas. There's a record from Jamaica, there's a couple found Bermuda, they were lucky. A couple in Hispaniola, a couple showed up in Cuba, but basically they all come down to the Bahamas. So very narrow range. It's always been a rare species. And back here in '51 is when the first census was done for the Kirtland's warbler. What they did was they map out all the available habitat, jack pine about 5 to 15 to 20 feet tall, and they went to all those stands and counted all the singing males. So what you see here in this figure is the number of singing males. So in 1951, it was about 475. Then they said, okay, this is our baseline data. Then in 1961, they counted again, it was up to 500. So they said, okay, things are fine. We don't need to do too much. In 1971, though, they came back, and the population had dropped by 50%. So then all of a sudden the alarm bells went off, and that's when the management really started to kick in. And we'll describe some of that management. You can see, even though management started, things were cowbird controlled, more habitat management, things of that sort. The population remained stable, very low, for quite some time. At one time, all the Kirtland warblers in the world would fit into a bushel basket, basically. So then there was a fire, 1980, back here, right here. The Forest Service started a prescribed burn. It was designed to burn 450 acres, more or less. Then the winds shifted. Ended up burning 25,000 acres. A firefighter was killed, 300 structures burned. So a lot of tragedy associated with that fire. But from the Kirtland warbler perspective, there was a lag here, but then the numbers started to go up. So that fire may have kicked off that increase in the population. But by then also, habitat management was much better, the cowbird control was more effective, and these techniques together resulted in this increase so that by 2014 we were up to over 2,000 singing males, and subsequent counts have been in that neighborhood. There's expected to be a drop in numbers in the near term as a result of management not keeping up, but we think we'll still be able to keep up with 1,300 pairs, which is the current population goal. When the Kirtland warbler was first listed as being federally endangered back in 1972, the recovery goal was 1,000 singing males for breeding pairs. So that's what this line represents here. So you can see that that was achieved by about 2,000. And it's remained above ever since. So for that reason, because the recovery goals were met, the Kirtland warbler was delisted in 2019. It's not threatened or endangered any longer. But it's still the rarest migratory songbird in North America. So what's being done on the breeding grounds? So this is obviously the northern lower peninsula, and right here, that would be Grayling right here. Each of these areas shown in color are lands managed specifically for Kirtland warblers, about 220,000 acres total. And the state lands are shown in black and the federal in gray. And those agencies coordinate extremely closely to ensure there's always a suitable amount of habitat available for Kirtland warblers, which is roughly 35,000 acres, where you'd have jack pine 5 to 15 feet tall in large tracts of at least 80 acres, but preferably in hundreds of thousands of acres of contiguous habitat. The habitat looks like this. Just this young jack pine with small openings in between, and the Kirtlands will nest on the ground right at the edge of these clearings. So from the air, it looks like this. Each of these clearings here. And this is all created specifically for Kirtland's warbler and planted in that specific pattern. This is the natural landscape right here. So quite a difference, but it's clearly resulted in recovery of the Kirtland's warbler. Now, associated with the Kirtland's warblers are a number of other species. So when we manage for Kirtland's warblers, it brings along a host of other species. So I'll start up here and you can call out what it is, okay? Right there.
Upland sandpiper.
There we go, upland sandpiper. The upland sandpiper is rather local in Michigan now, and this is one of the strongholds for upland sandpipers in Michigan. All right, this will be a little bit tougher. Nope. Lincoln sparrow.
Lincoln.
There we go. All right, very good. There's a little bit of gray here in the superciliary area, a little bit of a buffy wash here, very fine streaks on the side. It's a boreal species that just breeds as far south as the jack pine plains. And how about this guy right here? Whippoorwill. All right, there we go. So this too, the jack pine plains are probably one of the strongholds for whippoorwills. It's a rapidly declining species across North America. And this one?
Spruce grouse.
Spruce grouse. It's about the only place it is the only place it occurs in the lower peninsula. So there are just a very few. And I spent 15 years working in those stands. I've seen spruce grouse twice. So, well, the other thing that's being done in terms of management is cowbird control. As you know, the cowbird is an obligate parasite, meaning it does not build its nest, it cannot raise its own young. It lays its eggs in the nests of other species who then raise cowbirds. at the expense of their own typically. Here's the male in a courtship display, here's the female, kind of just determining whether it's worth bothering with this male or not. So after the population went down to really about 250 or so pairs in 1971, they started controlling cowbirds. At first, it was rather crude. They were just trying to shoot the birds. But that's pretty difficult to do across a large expanse. So Nick Cuthbert, who was at Central Michigan University, worked with others and developed a cage, a trap, where they would put this out in the middle of the cowbird, in the middle of the Kirtland warbler colonies, because they nested typically in colonies. And then they would put cowbird decoys in here that they would trap in Ohio and bring up to Michigan. They would have seed and water for the cowbirds. And then the males would be displaying, and that would attract females down into a chute into the trap that they wouldn't get out of. And then they would check those traps every now and then, remove the cowbirds, euthanize them. At one time they served a very good purpose. They helped with the cowbird or the Peregrine falcon reintroduction program in Detroit, so they would freeze them and ship them down. So they're getting used to this. One species helping another. So it was very successful. At one point, the amount of productivity by Kirtland's warblers, the number of young produced was close to zero, but once because of cowbird parasitism. But then once they removed the cowbirds, it went up to about 2.5 to 3 young per nest. So it really made a big difference, and was instrumental in saving the Kirtland's warblers. Now another part is you can't really protect that habitat or really have good support for protection of the species unless you try to reach out to a broader audience. So what the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team has done, this is a group of biologists and others that all get together to talk about Kirtland's Warbler protection, is develop a number of programs. So right up here, you see a group of people. You can see them looking very intently. And Michigan Audubon Society sponsors tours for Kirtland's warblers in May and June. So they meet at Hartley Pine State Park, and then they caravan out for the birds. And so the Michigan Audubon leaders that lead these tours are very skilled, and they'll find a bird that really sits in a prominent perch. There's good lighting, so it can be photographed well. It's near the road, and they'll have just the right bird that will behave well for all the people coming on the tours. So it works out pretty well, and I understand that 98% or 99% of the tours see Kirtland's warblers, so it's very effective. And they get people from all across the U.S., Sweden, UK, Canada, a number of places come. So it is a little bit of a burst to the local economy when these visitors come to see Kirtland's warblers. They also have a Kirtland's Warbler Festival in Roscommon, so they bring in people. They have all kinds of other natural history things that also call attention to the Kirtland's warblers and generate local support. And the same thing is happening here in the Bahamas here. So here a group of Bahamas teachers and a couple of students, and both Michigan students and Bahamas students submit drawings for a calendar that's published every year. And then the winning entries appear in this calendar, and then this calendar here that you see here is distributed back into Michigan and Bahamas. So it helps emphasize this international connection. And it's been very popular. So at least I know one of the principals in the Bahamas really well, and she was really, really proud when one of her nieces won the award. Now, the real black box to all this, in Kirtland's Warbler protection, at least the most difficult part in understanding what we do conservation-wise, is migration. Recently, Nathan Cooper at the Smithsonian was putting out a type of a tag called a geolocator, light sensitive, so it can detect latitude and longitude, and then records this. You can program it to record at various times during the day. And then if you capture the bird again, you can download those data and you know exactly where that bird was going within a fair bit of error. So what he found is that here is the wintering grounds here in Bahamas. The darker colors indicate where it's the highest likelihood of these birds occurring. So this is for one individual, so it occurred mostly in the central Bahamas based on these data. And then in the spring, it flew up here through Florida, up through here to Michigan, in the northern Lower Peninsula where it's summer. And in the fall, they take a more easterly route shown by these dashed lines and then back. And so the Kirtland's warblers tend to go back to the same spot year after year on the breeding grounds, and the same thing in the winter. So when we are studying the birds in the winter, we can find the same color banded individual at the same sites, even though they move around together. Now so that's the basic migration route for one bird there. And this is where the birds are concentrated on the migration route. So then when the birds fly from Bahamas here, they have to fly over open water, and then they'll come into southern Georgia and northern Florida, where they seemingly seem to come down to roost and perhaps refuel and get ready to complete the migration. And then also there's a little bit of a concentration here in Ohio. So McGee Marsh and the Lake Erie shoreline is an area where Kirtland's warbler was seeing. Point Peely? Yeah?
Yeah, so we can ask about Point Peely.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, two really important spots. And so that's the rough migration route here. And so this is really, if we're going to look at migration based on what we know now, we want to make sure that this is the area that we focus. But there's still enough uncertainty that it's not worth putting a lot of effort into it at this point. In how many days do you think it might, the shortest time it takes a bird to fly from here to here? How many days? 1,500 miles.
15.
1 day off, 8 days. So you can make that travel in less than 8 days. Most of that time is probably spent at stopover sites and actual flying. But it's pretty remarkable that a bird that weighs less than an ounce or about an ounce can make that 1,500 miles in 8 days. So the weather conditions have to be just right for that to happen. So, when we started our work in the Bahamas back in 2002, the literature suggested that, the scientific literature suggested that the birds were in the northern Bahamas, Grand Bahama, Abaco, Andros, the Pine Islands. That's where Caribbean pine occurs on the Bahamas. And then these other islands down here from Eleuthera on down do not have pine. So a paper published in 1998 said, well, the Kirtland's warblers are up here, guys, so that's where you need to focus your conservation efforts. So we started our work on Andros, one of the Pine Islands, and we found 3 birds in intensive work in 1 winter. That's not too bad compared to what other people had done. One person went down for 6 weeks and didn't see a single one. But we use playback, and they just hide into the shrubs. I'll show you that. It's real hard to find. But the last week we were there on Andros, a group from Bahamas National Trust, a non-government organization based in Nassau, which is here, said we found 6 birds in 1 spot in Eleuthera. That just exceeded every possible expectation. So we talked, at the time one of my colleagues, Joe Wenderly, was down there. We talked for 5 minutes and we changed our whole project. From studying the birds here on the pine and kind of looking at it, how they respond to fire, to doing intensive work on Kirtland's warblers and Eleuthera. Just changed totally everything. But it really has paid off. Now subsequently, and it's difficult to go to the Bahamas in the winter, I'll have to admit, but we've done surveys from Grand Bahama, Abaco, Nassau, New Providence, Eleuthera, Cat Island, San Salvador, Long Island, and down here off the map a little bit, Turks and Caicos, using playback. The way you find Kirtland's warblers in the winter is you just play back the song and the calls, and the birds will come in. So birds are more or less responsive. We do transects in each of those areas, and from that we can more or less deduce where the birds are most common. So we found that the central Bahamas, where there's compass, is where most of the birds are located. We did a lot of playback up here in Abaco, under the Pine Islands, after we did some of this work. And in 3 weeks, setting up random transects throughout the whole island, we found 3 birds at 1 site. And they weren't in pine, they were in compass. And so just one tiny spot down here in Abaco.
What's a coppice?
Coppice is a low, shrubby, hardwood type of growth. I'll show you some photographs of that. Yeah, good question. So it's real dense, shrubby. Take a real dense dogwood thicket, throw in a few autumn olive and buckthorn, and then multiply the density by 5 times, and you've kind of got what coppice is like. So that's where the birds are. We haven't had any data since to suggest otherwise. So here we go. This is the winter habitat. This is the coppice, this real dense stuff. The only way you can get through that stuff is with a machete if you're going to set up transects for netting and that sort of stuff. So actually, we did some, we have a project director down there that did a lot of that. But we even hired Haitians to do that who couldn't even read or write. So we had contracts where literally someone signed with an X, and that had to go through the Office of the Nature Conservancy, but it did work. So you've got this really dense coppice, and they especially like coppice for this dense hardwood shrubbery with black torch. It's got these small black berries, blueberry size, and white sage with these magenta berries. So where you get these fruits, fruiting prolifically, you tend to find Kirtland warblers. And this is another site of the same thing. You can get pretty good expanses of this in certain areas. And we'll talk about some of the factors that create that habitat. They include storms right along the shoreline. So you get the salt spray that stunts the growth, and you get dense shrubs. And the black torch and the white sage will grow there. Another natural process is fire. If you have a hurricane, a lot of down debris, and you have a dry, really dry period after that, it could be really droughty in winter in the Bahamas, some fires will get started. But probably most of the birds are showing up in habitats created by us. So power lines are really an area where we find birds, where they have to cut it to maintain power line right away, prevent the trees from growing up into the wires, and a lot of black torch and white sage grows right along those corridors. Another one, which is very, very odd, are goats. So normally goats and islands are a really bad mix. But in the Bahamas, they've got wild dogs. So the few goat farmers that they have, they fence the goats in. So you can actually control where the goats go. And it turns out that the goats are really good for Kirtland's warblers because they're browsing everything all the time, and the black torch and the white sage only grow in fairly open sunny spots. Furthermore, the goats require water. So it gets drier and drier as the winter progresses in the Bahamas. So you have to have goats where the water table is fairly high. And that in turn sustains more productivity and more fruit production. So the goats, with these goat farms really do a lot of good for Kirtland's warblers. The slash and burn agriculture is another factor, but generally you find where you map suitable habitat, but you often find there's been some evidence of goat grazing or there's active goat grazing. Okay, so the Kirtland's warblers share the Bahamas habitat with other species, so I'll quiz everybody again. Okay, what's this one? Yeah. Close.
There's a timer.
It's a hummingbird. It's the Bahama woodstar.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Okay? It's found only in the Bahamas, endemic to the Bahamas. So, here's another one.
Common yellow bird?
Close. It's another bird found only in the Bahamas. So guess what it is?
A Bahama yellow bird.
There we go. It's the Bahama yellowthroat right here. So it's got this little yellow right up here, just above the mask. Sounds really different. It occurs in dry habitat, wet. This is the greater Antillean bullfinch. This is how many people have misnetted. Okay, so you see that, Bill? You take it out of a misnet, you better feed it a stick, otherwise you're going to have it hanging on your finger. And then you've got the great lizard cuckoo here, a really phenomenal bird that may actually be separated out from the great lizard Cuba, may end up being the Bahama lizard cuckoo. You have to take a look at the big picture, not just winter or breeding separately and think you're doing a good job in conservation. So one of the major stresses we think in the Bahamas is drought. It gets drier, as we mentioned, later in the winter. So when that happens, there are fewer food resources and birds may have poorer body condition. I'm saying males here specifically because we just were able to capture enough males to show this pattern. So when the males are in poor body condition, they leave later, takes them longer to put on fat to migrate, and it may slow migration. So, with these two factors and the poor body condition, that means they arrive late on the breeding grounds. And Sarah Rockwell, who was the Miss Money at the time, was demonstrated that when they arrive late, they produce fewer young. And the amount of delay is related to the severity of the drought. So the drier it is, the later they arrive on the breeding grounds. And male survivor rates are lower after drought. So drought does affect what goes on in the breeding grounds and then what happens to the population.
What about the females?
Couldn't capture enough to get the pattern. So that's why we're specifying males, but it's probably similar. Yeah. So there's still a lot of things that we have not resolved, of course, but there is a conservation team, and that's broken up into programmatic areas: breeding team, a non-breeding team, and a human dimensions, which is basically ecotourism and socioeconomics. We each work from a work plan that's developed through reviewing the literature, figuring out what the obstacles are to getting habitat on the ground at both ends of the range. We're also trying to build up an endowment. It's now up to about $500,000, and this is between American Bird Conservancy, Michigan DNR, Fish and Wildlife Service. And the reason this endowment is critical is we mentioned that the bird is conservation reliant. So if you stop managing 15 or 20 years from now, it'd be go right back down toward extinction again. So we're trying to build a long-term fund that will spin off this money to ensure that the management takes place if there isn't enough money in the agencies to support the management work. So you never know what's going to happen that way. So we've got priority breeding projects too on the breeding ground. So one, we want to expand the Kirtland's Warbler range. Right now, as I mentioned, 95% are right here, and they're just a few pairs scattered in Ontario, Upper Peninsula, and Wisconsin. So there are active efforts to expand the range out in Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula and Ontario. We're trying to adopt new forestry practices. Jack pine for Kirtland's warblers, because it grows at such a high density, has a terrible value. The foresters hate it. So they're trying to figure out how to interplant red pine, or maybe alter the density of jack pine that will support Kirtland's warblers, but still have a market, so they can bring everybody along on Kirtland's warbler protection. Cowbirds are not a problem right now. Numbers have dropped. The parasitism rate is close to 0. But we still need to monitor because we don't know when the populations of cowbirds might start to increase again. And in fact, in the last year or two, there's been a suggestion that parasitism is going up slightly. So that's a really important ongoing piece of work. And landscape considerations. We have to consider bluebirds. We have to consider, you can see this really conspicuous grasshopper right there, the secretive locust. It's found only in the jack pine country of Michigan, nowhere else in the world. So when you manage for Kirtland's warblers, we want to make sure that we consider things of that sort as well. So, non-breeding threats. This is New Providence, where Nassau is located. For those of you that have been to the Bahamas, this is the airport. This is downtown Nassau. And this has expanded since. So at least on New Providence, where a lot of Kirtland's warblers were collected in the 1890s by various ornithologists, there was a lot of habitat here, but it's virtually gone here on Nassau. But the other islands are okay. So we don't have as much development pressure, but it is beginning to increase. And the very island we studied the birds the most on Eleuthera is now the second most visited island in the Bahamas. So we mentioned that the storms create that shrubby habitat along the coast. Obviously, that's where people put their homes and resorts. So that's a potential problem. Climate change is probably the most serious at this point. It's supposed to get drier in the Caribbean with time. And even more alarming, of course, you're going to get a rise in sea level, maybe up to 2 meters or 6 feet. The total population of Bahamas is about 350,000. The highest point in the Bahamas is all of 200 feet above sea level. I've got the privilege of climbing the highest peak in the Bahamas. And about 80% of the Bahamas is under 10 feet. So that's a serious threat to Kirtland's warblers, but to Bahamians. So they've actually been talking about maybe moving to Bahamians to other countries. Maybe the birds are going to be more easily, a little bit more adaptable than human populations, because they do show up in Hispaniola and other places occasionally. During the Ice Age, they had to move around. So while it's a very serious immediate change, we'll have to see what happens in the future. But it's something we're concerned about. Invasive species like this jumbie can really take over and shade out the white sage and the black torch. Another one is lack of capacity and funding. There are not a lot of Bahamians that are trained in ornithology. So in the early days of the project, we did train 8 Bahamians. We helped support their undergraduate education. We brought them to Michigan. And a number of them are now practicing ornithologists in the Bahamas and in conservation programs. And so that's been a real important part of our work, and continues to be an important part of our work as we support Bahamians in a variety of projects related to Kirtland's warblers and related activities. So here we are, increasing conservation capacity. We're working with several organizations to do that. So we train people. Lino Davis here, we supported the students through their undergraduate education, but Lino went on to get his PhD, especially in spatial analysis, and now he's working in the Bahamas and that kind of activity. And this in turn is leading to his helping out, mapping out winter habitat. We're working with Mike Eckerish at Antioch University to map out habitats in the central Bahamas, and then from that we can try to deduce if winter habitat might be limited. We're also working on describing the home range, so once we put those two components together, we'll have our very first cut at whether the non-breeding habitat is an important factor in regulating Kirtland's warbler population. We work with the government electricity company on rights-of-way management. I mentioned the birds like to follow those rights-of-ways. We're working really closely with the goat farmer. We've got a really great guy, Mr. Simonet, an amazing guy, just incredible integrity, knows the Prime Minister, is very careful how he goes about managing his goats. He's training his kids to do the same, and we're working with him to develop ecotourism on his farm. So last few times we've gone down, we give him $25 per person to go on the farm, and we give him binoculars and his wife, and it's really beginning to turn the corner here. And then we're also working with Mike Eckerish and wild sage and black torch propagation to see if we can at least figure out ways to grow these plants and put them back onto the landscape if it's needed. So there's Lino. Capacity is one of the maps. I won't go into all the details on those maps, but each one of these colors represents a different habitat. The rights-of-way management, the goats, the black torch, and the white sage. So here are some of the students, and as I've been working in conservation for 30, 40 years. This has probably been the most exciting part of the whole career, is seeing these students really blossom and do tremendous things for conservation. So I mentioned Lino Davis already, that's got his PhD, is now teaching at the University of Bahamas, and he in turn is training other students, which is exactly what we want. Scott has become a consultant. Zico, but by being a consultant, can tell people, watch out for Kirtlands. This is what you have to be careful of. So it's a really important role. Keith Philippe here is working on climate change in the Bahamas. Zico McKenzie is just finishing up his PhD in California, working on coastal dynamics. And Jerry Miller's ready to go to law school in the UK. So we need conservation easement types of legislation in the Bahamas, so we're hoping we can kind of rope her into that at some point. So we really work a lot with communities and increase citizen science opportunities, especially for younger people. So this is the calendar again. And so what's next? There's a lot to do yet. So we want to build this Kirtland's Warbler Fund. We ultimately want it to be about $9 million. And we figure if we get $9 million in the endowment, that will spin off enough money to ensure that we always have enough management taking place to support the bird and have that a minimum of 1,300 breeding pairs. We have a business plan that we work from where we prioritize everything, so it's a very carefully thought out process, and budgets assigned with each of the anticipated activities. And the Kirtland's Warbler has been kind of a model for conservation of other species because of the intensity of the effort and the detail that's gone into the protection of the Kirtland's Warbler and the number of people who have been involved. Okay, so this is one way you can help. How many people have a Kirtland's Warbler license? All right. Okay, you don't have one yet, right? All right. So that's good. So this can really help. It doesn't all go to Kirtland's Warbler, it goes to non-game, but it does help the Kirtland's Warbler activity. So I encourage you to get the plate. That's one thing you can do directly. And I just, I don't want to emphasize student, and I'm talking about Kirtland's Warblers, but we've had hundreds to maybe thousands of people working on this project over time. So I'm not going to read all of these, but those that you see in the blue font are those agencies that have played critical roles in conservation for the Kirtland's Warbler. In yellow are some of the international organizations, both government and non-government. So here we have Bahamas National Trust, University of Bahamas, landowners that have allowed us access to study the birds on their property, and then major funders. So we've had a lot of really large grants actually to help support this work over time. We've been very, very fortunate that the International Program of the Forest Service right up here has supported our work every year for 20 years. So that continuity of funding allows us to grow the program. And then especially thank the Towsley Foundation here. It's a Midland Foundation that has provided $800,000 actually to help support staff to support this program over the last 10 years. And it's been, without that continuity of staff, you're sunk. And you just have to have that. And many have donated to this Kirtland's Warbler Fund. So we're building this endowment fund right now. Anyone that's interested in doing that, let me know. And I have a colleague, Joe Wonderly, who's kind of hatched this project in a meeting in Newfoundland, an AOS meeting. Actually started out at a meeting in Bahamas and we were on a boat and watching city tours. I said, let's start talking with Bahamians about this. That was back in 1997. So these programs have a long life and take a long time to develop to make things happen. And then some of the project managers we've had down there, they're just down there for the whole season, Bahamian colleagues, and these are the students that we train. So as I mentioned, we provided funding for their undergraduate education, $30,000 per student. And they went to a variety of schools and couldn't be more happy with what they've done. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions, comments.
Why the attraction to only a certain size range of the pines?
To be honest, we don't know. But they do nest on the ground, so one hypothesis is that the jack pine branches come down to the ground, they like to nest under the branches. And once they get too high, you lose them. But it's kind of a guess in a way, okay? Yeah.
So what are the gaps in information? Because there seems to be a lot of information about the breeding grounds and non-breeding grounds, but you seem to mention that not a lot is known about migration.
Yeah, good question. The geolocators are really good because they give you a general idea where the birds occur, but there's an error of 50, 100 miles depending on conditions, but the data are retrieved by the geolocators. So we don't know exactly where they stop over. We don't know the exact locations where they stop over, how long they stay at those sites, or if there's differential mortality at different stopover sites along the way. And because the highest mortality probably occurs during migration, that's what some of the modeling is suggesting, very important information to know. But right now you're kind of hamstrung by a lack of technique to get to that degree of resolution. So when you get satellite transmitters that are small enough to put on a tiny little bird that weighs an ounce, that's when we'll begin to get that information. So that's a great question.
I'm wondering if eBird has helped at all, or is it not scientific enough for you to use? Are people seeing Kirtland's warblers in migration and putting them on their checklists, and does that help you?
Yeah, there's a guy, Mike Petrusha, that accumulates all the records of Kirtland's warblers. So we at least summarize those data. But eBird and that kind of database is sort of the big data sorts of questions.
Yeah.
And with Kirtland's warblers, it doesn't fall under that category. Nonetheless, it's always good to find out wherever a bird occurs. Yeah.
Since, excuse me, since they ground nest, don't they have some ground predators that are a problem?
They do, but they have pretty high reproductive success, and there are not a lot of ground predators in this area. There are no snakes really that are predators in this area. Probably the biggest one are 13-line ground squirrels that might take the young. Maybe blue jays occasionally taking eggs.
No fox or anything like that?
There are fox and coyotes back there, but doesn't seem to be a lot of mortality in the nest. yeah, but it's not that well known, exactly what the predators are, yeah.
Given that Audubon's gonna rename all birds that have a human connection,
Yeah,
do you have a preference for what your
I do,
bird would be called?
I do, yeah. First of all, there's gonna be pushback to that approach of renaming any bird named after a person. A lot of ornithologists have a different perspective on it, I'll put it that way. And with Kirtland's, it's named after a Dr. Kirtland in Cleveland, who discovered this bird, or discovered it and found it in Ohio. And he's not a bad guy. He's a surgeon, he was active in the Underground Railroad, Ohio legislature, you know, a lot better than I am. So, I kind of prefer keeping it Kirtland's. It's just a long tradition of doing that. The other thing is, what would you name it if you didn't call it Kirtland's? Okay, so jackpine, right? They're always in jackpine. Not in the Bahamas. You don't want to discriminate against that whole part of the range, right? Males and females have somewhat different color patterns. They don't want to have that kind of discrimination.
What if we call it, I have an idea, we call it the rare, super specific plant warbler.
I'm going to let you propose that. That would be neutral. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Wait, what? Oh, me, all right. Well, I think I would call it the Warbler of the Jack, similar to the Cock of the Rock, Andean Cock of the Rock.
That could be. We'll see what they come up with. Yep.
Do any of the Bahamians have a common name for that, the bird, rather than?
They don't.
Kirtland?
It's too rare.
It's too rare.
Yeah,
Okay.
because it just melts into that understood. We would never see it or find it except using playback.
Okay.
So that's the way we run these transections. I did, once we were driving at 30 miles an hour though, in one spot and I heard one call. But you really have to be with the birds for a long time down there before you can pick up that nuance.
Sure.
Yep.
So what's its Latin name then?
I'm sorry?
What's its Latin name? I assume it has.
It's Setophaga kirtlandi. So it's named after Kirtland's again.
What does it eat in the summertime?
Mostly insects, and then they'll eat blueberries once they start to ripen. So they, kind of like in the Bahamas, it's both insects and fruit.
Did you say that there's a locust or?
The secretive locust?
Yeah, is that something it eats?
I don't know.
What's the relation?
Yeah, I don't know. Probably not. It'd be more likely it goes for some of the spittle bugs you see, a variety of things that are probably a lot more common than that. Yeah.
What are the territory requirements of the birds on their breeding grounds? It strikes me that they must breed somewhat close to one another.
Yeah, they tend to breed, because the habitat is so localized and there
Yeah.
tend to be homogeneous stands of this habitat, they all pile into the same area, hence the term colonial. Not strictly colonial in that sense, but they're highly concentrated. And there, they will just take out their large territories, about 8 acres or so, which is very large for a warbler. And then they will just find small little openings, or when they plant the trees, they put furrows in. Sometimes they'll put their nest in the side of the furrow, and they'll look for that kind of habitat. To my eye, it looks pretty homogeneous, except for these openings, but they will avoid large openings or areas where the trees are too sparse.
But there's not a lot of territory defending
Oh yeah,
between, there is.
yeah. A couple times I was out and the females were just arriving, and so the males are singing like crazy, of course. And as soon as the female appears, the two males are going, following her right off the bat. They were so intent that one male landed on my shoe. And they were just singing to each other, and when they get really agitated, they have a different mode of singing. It's a very quiet, muted song, but very fast. And these two males are just singing that song like crazy, and I'm sure that female's okay. Which song is better? That's apparently a way a lot of females do discriminate among males, among other factors.
So with warmer winter, warmer springs and milder winters, are they showing up earlier or are they starting to breed earlier?
They are showing up a little bit earlier. I think last year or the year before, one showed up in late April for the first time. I don't know that enough birds have been looked at in any given year to have a real clear pattern yet.
Yeah, because it seems in some populations that there's something like this swallows us, they show up earlier, they start breeding earlier. But as we know, then there's a greater chance of running into really bad weather, inclement weather in the spring. And that might be causing some of the decline in some of these populations. Because they're breeding earlier, they run into really bad inclement weather. So I was wondering if that would be a risk for these.
It could be down the road, yeah. They leave the Bahamas typically last week in April, most of them. But the jackpine country is really a harsh environment. So you can get frost any month of the year. It's a pretty tough area. Good question, but that'd take a lot more intensive work than I think people have done so far.
Did you mention there was banding? So you know some of the same birds are coming back?
Yeah.
How long do they live?
The oldest one is, I think, 12 years. Typically, they average about 3 years. So it's a quick turnaround.
So nobody names them?
Oh yeah, people name. We're trying to ban one in the Bahamas, wouldn't go into the mist net, so it got named Stubborn.
I was curious when, during the day, if a person wanted to see them, is it better to go out in the morning or in the evening?
Morning, definitely.
Definitely morning.
Yeah, I put out a remote acoustic recorder a couple of years ago, and they go like crazy first thing in the morning. In fact, I actually sing one type of song more often first thing in the morning, is just pretty typical of warblers, and they switch into a more elaborate song. But it begins to taper off. Certainly the afternoon is quieter, but it will vary depending on where in the breeding season you are too. They'll sing more, obviously, early on.
The library will be closing in 30 minutes. All public computers will be shutting down in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So you mentioned that the population you don't think has ever been particularly large.
Probably not.
Do you think in times past there were other dense breeding locations, like maybe in other states?
Maybe. But probably Michigan was the center because they like the sandy soil with a lot of jackpine. And the only really extensive areas with that of contiguous habitat are in the northern Lower Peninsula. There are pockets in the UP, but recently there was a big wildfire in Ontario, just northeast of Georgian Bay, and they found 3 or 4 birds, but it's on Precambrian rock. They would find little pockets of soil. So people have done surveys in other parts of Ontario or Minnesota, and just haven't really found them.
So, you said that they have to be like 5 to 15 years old for jackpines. Are the Kirtland's warblers looking at how tall they are, or like their age, if they can somehow see that?
Probably in height. Yeah.
Which roughly corresponds to this?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Precisely.
So in these managed sites now, how are they going about the renewal process when these things get to be 15 to 18, 20 years old? Are they mowing them off, cutting them off?
There's a lot of discussion about that right now. Historically, what they've done is wait till they're 50 or 60 years old and then harvest the trees, and that would be sold as pulp.
Pulp, okay.
But they've only started managing the Kirtland's warbler intensively for about 40 years. So they're running out of jackpine. So now they're trying to figure out how to take 20, 30, 40-year-old jackpine, take that out, and put in the younger stuff. So they're talking about masticating trees, just ripping them all up and putting them on the ground. A number of other techniques that are under discussion on what to do. So So it's a delicate question, or a delicate balance right now, because before they started manufacturing the Kirtland's Warbler intensively, there was a lot of old stuff out there, but that's not the case anymore.
I thought the jack pine only germinated after fires.
They plant the trees.
Okay.
Yep.
Alright.
And then some cones will open without fire, but
Okay.
you're right, generally it's fire that generates especially large homogeneous stains of jet pine.
What about Camp Grayling? Are they cooperating at all?
Yeah, they are. So early on it was very contentious, but they actually create habitat through their activities, and when they create a patch of habitat with Kirtlands, they avoid it until the trees get tall enough, and then they'll resume activity.
Are they still using fire for management?
Very sparingly. That because of that one fire in 1980, they are very cautious. So it's mostly cut and plant. And then what they will do occasionally is, once they've cut the trees, they may burn whatever is left over after the cut. So there may be cones and other things. Wait to see if there's any germination of trees or sufficient germination of trees, and then decide what to do. Yeah, all good questions.
Well, if there are any other questions, thank you very much.
Yep. If you want more information on the birds here too, well, there are very few, so help yourself.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great question.